Welcome to the Carnival'z. You are listening Feathers of Love, a book by the Carnival'z. Every story begins with a moment, a spark that sets everything in motion. This is a tale of love, courage, and the bonds that define us. As the sun rises over a quiet campus and life stirs gently awake, two souls are about to cross paths in ways that will change them forever. This is not just a story, it's a journey through emotions, dreams, and the kind of love that leaves an everlasting mark. Let's begin where hearts open and destinies unfold. The rain was relentless that night, pouring down in heavy sheets that made the windshield wipers struggle to keep up. Jonathan was driving back home after a long day at the construction site. The dim glow of the headlights barely illuminated the winding road ahead, and the sound of rain pounding against the car drowned out the crackle of the old radio. He was humming along to a tune when a sudden flash of movement caught his eye. Slamming on the brakes, the car skidded to a stop, the tires screeching against the wet asphalt. Through the downpour, he saw a small sedan flipped over on its side, its metallic frame twisted and smoking. Heart pounding, Jonathan grabbed his phone and jumped out of the car, his boots splashing into the muddy water pooling on the road. He ran toward the wreckage, his breath fogging in the cold night air. Inside the crumpled vehicle, a young woman was trapped, blood streaming down her temple, her chest rising and falling unevenly. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Jonathan called out, his voice trembling. She stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. Jonathan's hands shook as he fumbled with his phone, dialing emergency services. The operator's calm voice instructed him to stay on the line, but the storm had worsened, and the signal was lost. He cursed under his breath, pocketing the phone as he knelt by the wreck. "I'll get you out of here," he promised, though his own fear was suffocating. The rain made the metal slick, and no matter how much he tried, the door wouldn't budge. Inside, the woman gasped for air, her face pale. "Please, my baby," she whispered again, motioning weakly toward the back seat. Jonathan peered through the shattered glass and saw a baby carrier overturned but intact. The infant was crying, its tiny fists flailing in fear. Summoning every ounce of strength, Jonathan smashed the side window with a rock, reaching inside to unbuckle the carrier. The baby's wails intensified as he pulled the carrier free and cradled it against his chest, shielding the child from the rain. "You're safe," he murmured to the baby, his voice breaking. But his relief was short-lived as he turned back to the woman. Her breathing had slowed, her head slumping against the seat. No, stay with me," Jonathan pleaded, his voice hoarse. He pressed his fingers to her pulse, feeling it weaken under his touch. The helplessness was unbearable. He screamed for help into the void of the storm, his voice lost to the howling wind. Minutes felt like hours as he stayed by her side, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement. But deep down, he knew. When the distant wail of an ambulance finally pierced the night, it was too late. The paramedics rushed to the scene, taking over as Jonathan stepped back, drenched and trembling. The baby was safe, they assured him, but the woman's life had slipped away. Jonathan stood there, watching the paramedics work, the weight of guilt pressing down on him like the storm clouds above. He didn't know her name, her story, or why she was on that road that night. But he knew one thing. He had failed. Despite his best efforts, he hadn't been able to save her. As the ambulance disappeared into the distance, Jonathan sank to his knees on the wet road. His mind replayed her final words, her desperate plea for help, and the look in her eyes. That night changed him forever. When he returned home, his wife found him sitting silently at the kitchen table, the baby carrier beside him. "I couldn't save her," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "But I will make sure my child can save others. I will make him a doctor, someone who can fight for life when it matters most." His voice was resolute, though his heart was heavy. It was a promise born of guilt and love, one that would shape the destiny of his son, Henry. Henry had always been a quiet child. In school, he was the boy who sat in the last row, avoided raising his hand, and dreaded being called upon. While other children played boisterously during recess, Henry often found solace in the small school library, losing himself in the pages of adventure novels or doodling aimlessly in his notebook. Academically, he was average at best. Subjects like mathematics and science felt like insurmountable mountains, and he struggled to keep up with his classmates. Teachers often described him as capable but unmotivated, a label that only made him retreat further into his shell. His classmates teased him occasionally, not maliciously, but enough to make him uncomfortable. "Henry, the daydreamer," they'd say, as he stared out the window during lessons, lost in his thoughts. He wasn't lazy, he was just different. While others dreamed of high scores and prestigious careers, Henry's dreams were shapeless, undefined. Jonathan, however, had always believed in his son. He saw Henry's quiet demeanor not as a weakness but as a strength. "You have a kind heart, Henry," he would say, ruffling his son's hair. "And that's more important than anything else in this world." The end of school and a father's dream. As Henry approached the end of his schooling, the looming question of what came next became impossible to ignore. His friends spoke excitedly of their plans: engineering, law, business, their paths seemingly clear. Henry, however, felt adrift. He had no idea what he wanted to do. Jonathan, on the other hand, knew exactly what he wanted for his son. The memory of that stormy night, the woman he couldn't save, and the promise he had made still haunted him. He had spent years nurturing the hope that Henry would become a doctor, someone who could succeed where he had failed. One evening, as the family sat together after dinner, Jonathan brought up the topic. "Henry," he began, his tone gentle but firm, "have you thought about what you want to do after school?" Henry hesitated, staring down at his plate. "Not really, Dad. I don't know." Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes earnest. "I have something in mind for you. I want you to go to medical college. I want you to become a doctor." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Henry's chest tightened, a knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. "A doctor?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Jonathan said, his voice steady. "You have the heart for it, Henry. You're kind, compassionate, and sensitive. That's what makes a great doctor. I believe in you." "But Dad," Henry began, his words tumbling out in a rush, "I don't think I can do it. I'm not good at science. And the idea of seeing people in pain, I don't know if I can handle it." Jonathan sighed deeply, his face softening. He reached across the table, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Henry, I understand that you're scared. I was scared too, that night when I couldn't save that woman. I've carried that guilt with me ever since, but I also know this. You have the potential to save lives, to make a difference in ways I never could. I'm not asking you to do this for me. I'm asking you to do this because I know you can." Henry looked into his father's eyes, seeing the weight of years of regret and hope reflected there. He wanted to protest, to say that it wasn't fair, that this wasn't his dream. But how could he, when his father had given so much, sacrificed so much for him? "Dad," Henry said quietly, his voice trembling, "I don't know if I can ever be the person you want me to be. But if it means that much to you, I'll try. I'll go to medical college. For you." Jonathan's face broke into a smile, his eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you, Henry. You don't know how much this means to me. And no matter what happens, I'll always be proud of you." As they embraced, Henry felt a pang of guilt. He wasn't doing this out of passion or conviction, but out of love for his father. In his heart, he wondered if that would be enough to sustain him in the years to come. The journey to the medical college was a mix of silence and occasional awkward conversation. Jonathan was beaming with pride, his hands firmly on the steering wheel, while Henry stared out the window, trying to calm the storm of emotions brewing inside him. It wasn't just nervousness, it was dread. "Henry," Jonathan said, breaking the silence, "did you know this college is one of the best in the country? They produce some of the finest doctors." Henry managed a weak smile. "That's great, Dad." Jonathan, oblivious to Henry's unease, continued, "When you graduate from here, people will look up to you. Dr. Henry? Sounds perfect, doesn't it? Henry nodded half-heartedly. He wasn't sure if the title sounded perfect or like the beginning of a long, exhausting nightmare. Arriving at the campus, the medical college stood tall and majestic, its grand gates adorned with intricate ironwork. Students bustled about, some carrying thick books, others chatting animatedly. The campus was pristine, with manicured lawns and imposing buildings that seemed to declare, "This is where greatness begins." As Jonathan parked the car, his excitement was almost palpable. "Look at this place, Henry. You're going to love it here." Henry wasn't so sure. The sprawling campus looked more intimidating than impressive. He followed his father reluctantly, clutching the necessary admission documents like they were a lifeline. Arriving at the campus. The medical college stood tall and majestic, its grand gates adorned with intricate ironwork. Students bustled about, some carrying thick books, others chatting animatedly. The campus was pristine, with manicured lawns and imposing buildings that seemed to declare, "This is where greatness begins." As Jonathan parked the car, his excitement was almost palpable. "Look at this place, Henry. You're going to love it here." Henry wasn't so sure. The sprawling campus looked more intimidating than impressive. He followed his father reluctantly, clutching the necessary admission documents like they were a lifeline. Inside the administration building, the reception area was crowded with parents and students, all chattering and shuffling about. Jonathan strode confidently to the counter, while Henry hung back, wishing he could disappear into the floor. "We're here for admission," Jonathan announced, his voice full of pride. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression, handed him a form. "Fill this out and submit it along with the documents." Jonathan took the form, his confidence unwavering. "Thank you. Come on, Henry, let's find a spot to sit." Jonathan sat down at a desk and began filling out the form with the enthusiasm of a man fulfilling a lifelong dream. Henry, on the other hand, scanned the room nervously, feeling completely out of place. "Henry, what's your blood group again?" Jonathan asked, scribbling furiously. "A B positive," Henry replied. "Right. And allergies?" "No, Dad, I don't have any." Jonathan grinned. Good, see? You're already perfect for this." Henry sighed, running a hand through his hair. As they approached the submission counter, Jonathan handed over the completed form with a flourish. "Here you go, all done." The woman at the counter looked at the form, then at Jonathan. "Sir, you filled out your own details in the student section." Jonathan blinked, then looked down at the form. "Oh, I did?" "Yes, sir," she said, barely suppressing a smirk. Henry couldn't help but laugh, despite his nerves. "Dad, are you trying to enroll yourself?" Jonathan chuckled, scratching the back of his head. "Maybe I should. I'd probably make a great doctor." They corrected the form, much to the amusement of the other parents and students in line. After the paperwork was finally in order, they were directed to meet the dean for a final interview. The dean's office was as grand as the rest of the campus, with dark wood furniture and walls lined with bookshelves. "Ah, welcome," the dean said, gesturing for them to sit. He was a tall, stern man with glasses perched on the tip of his nose. Jonathan spoke first, his voice brimming with enthusiasm. "This is my son, Henry. He's going to be a fantastic doctor one day." Henry shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unsure how to respond. The dean nodded, looking over Henry's application. "Henry, why do you want to become a doctor?" Henry hesitated, glancing at his father. He knew the answer he was supposed to give, but couldn't bring himself to say it. Instead, he stammered, I want to help people." The dean raised an eyebrow, sensing the lack of conviction in Henry's voice, but said nothing. After a few more formalities, he signed the papers and handed them over. "Welcome to the college, Henry. I hope you're ready for the challenges ahead." As they left the office, Jonathan clapped Henry on the back. "See, that wasn't so bad. You're officially on your way to becoming a doctor." Henry forced a smile, his mind racing. The weight of the journey ahead was already pressing down on him, but for now, he let his father's happiness overshadow his doubts. The drive back home was quieter than usual. Jonathan was still riding the high of getting Henry admitted to one of the best medical colleges, but Henry's thoughts were elsewhere. The reality of leaving his home, his room, and the only life he'd known was starting to sink in. As they reached their modest house, the warm yellow light from the living room spilled onto the porch. Jonathan's mother, Margaret, was sitting in her rocking chair, knitting something colorful and cozy. "Back already?" Margaret asked, looking up from her work as they entered. "Yes, Ma," Jonathan said with a grin. "Our Henry here is officially a medical student now." Margaret's face lit up. "Oh, how wonderful! A doctor in the family at last. Your mother would have been so proud of you, Henry." Henry smiled faintly, taking a seat on the couch. He loved his grandmother's comforting presence, but the weight of the day still pressed heavily on his shoulders. Dinner and a question. That night, as they sat around the table for dinner, the mood was light. Margaret had cooked Henry's favorite dishes: mashed potatoes, roasted chicken, and apple pie for dessert. Jonathan was in high spirits, recounting the day's events to his mother with great enthusiasm. But Henry had a question weighing on his mind, one he had avoided asking for years. As they were finishing their meal, he finally spoke up. "Dad," Henry began hesitantly, "can I ask you something?" Jonathan paused mid-bite, his expression softening. "Of course, son. What's on your mind?" Henry looked down at his plate, unsure how to phrase it. "It's about Mom. I never really knew how she died. You never talk about it." The room grew quiet. Margaret put down her fork, her eyes glistening as she looked at her son and grandson. Jonathan sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's not an easy story to tell," Jonathan admitted, his voice tinged with sadness. "Your mother, Emily, was the most amazing woman I've ever known. She was kind, strong, and she loved you more than anything in this world." Henry nodded, his heart pounding as he waited for his father to continue. "She was diagnosed with leukemia when you were just a toddler," Jonathan said. "We fought hard, Henry. We tried every treatment, every option. But in the end, it wasn't enough." Margaret wiped away a tear, her knitting forgotten. "Those were the hardest days of my life," Jonathan continued. "But even when she was sick, Emily always put you first. She would sing to you, read you bedtime stories even when she could barely stand." Henry swallowed the lump in his throat, feeling a pang of guilt for not remembering her better. "She made me promise one thing before she passed," Jonathan said, his voice breaking. "She made me promise to raise you to be kind, strong, and brave. And I've done my best, Henry. I hope I've made her proud." Henry reached across the table, placing a hand on his father's. "You've done more than enough, Dad. Thank you." The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the memories settling over them. Then, Margaret cleared her throat, determined to lighten the mood. "Well," she said with a small smile, "your mother would also want us to finish this apple pie. She'd never let us waste dessert." They all chuckled, the tension easing as they shared the pie and exchanged warm memories of Emily. The next 2 days flew by in a whirlwind of preparation. Jonathan helped Henry pack his belongings, while Margaret fussed over him, insisting on adding extra snacks and warm clothes to his suitcase. "Grandma," Henry groaned as she tucked another pair of socks into his bag, "I'm going to college, not Antarctica." "You'll thank me when it gets cold," Margaret replied firmly. "And don't forget to eat properly. These medical students, always so busy, they forget to eat." Jonathan chuckled, watching the two of them bicker. "She's not wrong, Henry. You'll be lucky if you get more than 2 hours of sleep once the classes start." "Thanks for the encouragement, Dad," Henry said dryly, rolling his eyes. Finally, the day came for Jonathan to take Henry to the hostel. Margaret hugged Henry tightly before they left, her eyes brimming with tears. "Be good, my boy," she said, "and call me if you need anything." "I will, Grandma," Henry promised, feeling a pang of homesickness already. The drive to the college was uneventful until they stopped for lunch at a roadside diner. Jonathan insisted on ordering an absurd amount of food, claiming it was a celebration meal. "Dad, there's no way we're finishing all this," Henry said as the waiter brought plate after plate to their table. "Speak for yourself," Jonathan said, digging into a massive burger. "This might be the last proper meal you get for a while." Henry couldn't help but laugh. Despite his nerves about starting this new chapter of his life, he was grateful for his father's efforts to make the day special. As they pulled up to the hostel, reality hit Henry like a freight train. Students were everywhere, carrying suitcases, hugging their parents, and exploring the campus. Jonathan parked the car and turned to Henry. "Ready?" "No," Henry admitted, his voice trembling slightly. Jonathan smiled, his eyes full of understanding. "You'll be fine, Henry. You've got this." With a deep breath, Henry stepped out of the car, ready to face whatever lay ahead. And that brings us to the end of the first episode of Feathers of Love. If you're enjoying this heartfelt journey, you can read the complete ebook by purchasing it from our website, The Carnival'z. The link is in the description. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more audiobooks like this, and stay tuned for the next episode coming next week. Currently, we have 3 amazing ebooks that we're sure you'll love, so make sure to check them out on our website. Our mission is to redefine the entertainment industry with original, gripping, and unforgettable stories, bringing you narratives that stay with you forever. Thank you for listening, and we wish you a wonderful day ahead. Keep dreaming, keep reading.